Hi everyone, Dr. Hinkey here. And whoops, let's get into slideshow mode. Welcome to chapter 2, basic chemistry. So today I'll go over, hit the highlights, and walk through some basic chemistry, and then later on we'll get a video lecture on chapter 3. And those are the only two things we're going to focus on this week. I have a lot of students who tell me they took biology because they were worried about chemistry because it's so hard, or they were worried about physics because it's so hard. And alas, all biology is chemistry. So we have to touch on some. Luckily, we are going to look at a simplified version of chemistry because we're looking at organic chemistry and specifically biological chemistry. So our outline, the topics we'll hit today for the chapter: chemical elements. We'll talk a little bit about what those are, about molecules and compounds, how we form those. We'll look at the chemistry of water, and then finish up with a little bit on acids and bases. So everyone's probably familiar with this. This is the periodic table of the elements. These are arranged into rows and columns called periods and groups based on similarities in their chemical reactions and their reactivity. They're in groups up and down. And then, sorry, keep hitting my mouse. As I hit my mouse, go all over the place. So all of these elements would behave similarly in chemical reactions. All of these would behave similarly in chemical reactions, and we'll get into why that is. I don't know why this is so hypersensitive to my mouse. So we all know the periodic table of the elements. So what are elements? Elements are substances that can't be broken down into anything smaller and still retain the same properties. If we break elements down, so elements are what we see here, periodic table of the elements. Each of those is an element. All matter is anything that takes up space. Right? So it has mass and it takes up space. So everything on this table has mass and takes up space. All matter is made of elements, which are these: hydrogen, helium, lithium, and on through all of these. So all of the elements that make up matter. And one unit of any one of these is an atom. Right? So an atom is a single unit of any of these elements. None of these can be broken down into smaller subunits and still retain the properties they have. So this is the simplest unit. As we learned, atoms come together to form molecules, come together to form our macromolecules that form the organelles, that form the cells, that form the tissue, and on and on. So this is our basic unit. Atoms are made of smaller parts, protons, neutrons, and electrons, but it's the specific configuration and number of those that give the elements their specific chemical properties and physical properties. And so we can't break it down to those subatomic particles without losing the properties that make an element an element. So we have 92 elements that are naturally occurring. Out of all those elements that are naturally occurring, 6 elements make up 95% of the body weight of all living organisms, any living organism. Those are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, or as I like to refer to them, Schnapps. All living things are made up of Schnapps. So when we talk about chemistry, organic versus inorganic, the most abundant living elements in all living organisms are our Schnapps. And if we look at the periodic table, we see they're all up here close to the top. We really don't need the bottom of the periodic table. We don't need this middle part. We're only interested in kind of these first 3 rows. So these are the areas we're going to focus on. That lets us, for example's sake, we'll pull in a few others, and we have a lot of the metallic elements, a lot of things that are important for us, like sodium, magnesium, helium, aluminum, chlorine. All of these are involved, calcium, potassium. These are all really important for us. So we mention them, we talk about them in class, iron, but really for our organic portion of chemistry, here's what we're going to deal with mostly. That simplifies chemistry significantly, using just the organic compounds. And one of our questions talks about what makes an organic molecule an organic molecule. Many people point out carbon, that we need carbon. We need lots of carbon in long chains or in rings, lots of carbons attached to each other, but those carbons must have hydrogens attached to them to make it organic. So carbon dioxide has carbon, but it's not organic because there's no hydrogen attached to that carbon. So petroleum hydrocarbons are derived from once living, now dead and decomposing things. One of the things they lose as they decompose initially is oxygen. What's left behind, those hydrocarbons, are organic because they're long chains of carbons with hydrogens attached. So when we get back to our macromolecules, we'll touch on this a little bit more. But organic molecules must have carbon with hydrogen attached to be classified as organic. So let's look at the building blocks of our elements. The smallest unit of an element that displays the property of that element that still retains all its chemical characteristics is an atom. So we think that's a single unit of an element. An element and its atoms share the same name. So it's an atom of hydrogen, an atom of helium. Our atoms are composed of those subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, electrons. The protons are positively charged. So in the middle of our atom, we have a nucleus. When we talk about cells, we're going to talk about a nucleus too. So be careful, don't get them confused. Make sure we know if we're talking about chemistry nucleus, which is the center of an atom, or cellular nucleus, which is the central part holding the DNA of a eukaryotic cell. But for now, we're talking about chemistry. So our nucleus is just the core, the center of our atom, and in it we have protons and neutrons. Our protons have a positive charge. Our neutrons, neutral, have no charge. These have been assigned a weight or a mass of 1 atomic mass unit. So when we talk about atomic mass, we're talking about how many protons and neutrons they have. Circling around that nucleus, but outside of the nucleus, are the electrons, and the electrons have a negative charge. Our electrons are so very, 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 very small compared to protons or neutrons that their mass is negligible. It would be, if a proton is 1 atomic mass unit, an electron would be 0.00000, keep going with those zeros for a long time before we get to the 1. So we can just not even consider them when we talk about the mass of an atom. So my atom has a nucleus where I find my protons and neutrons, and then I have the electrons circling around outside of this. My atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus. Remember, my protons have a positive charge, Circling around the outside, my neutrons have no charge. Circling around the outside, I have negatively charged electrons, and they're going to balance. The number of protons is usually the same as the number of electrons. I'm not going to add them into mass because they have none, or it's negligible. My atomic number, though, is always the number of protons in the nucleus. We'll talk about ions in a little bit, but those are atoms that either have an extra electron or are missing an electron or two. So they don't balance, but typically when we look at atoms, all the elements in the periodic table have a net charge of 0 because we're balanced, the same number of positively charged subatomic particles and negatively charged subatomic particles. So if we look, my proton has a positive charge, has an atomic mass of 1 unit, and it's located in the nucleus. My neutron is neutral, no charge, has an atomic mass of 1. It's also located in the nucleus. And my electrons are circling outside of the nucleus and have a charge of -1. They are negatively charged. We are giving them an atomic mass of 0 because it would be so small as to make it an insignificant contributor to the mass. And these are located, we call these electron shells. Those are the areas where the electrons are circling. So in this example, if the brown circles represent the protons, the green the neutrons, and the blue the electrons, I have 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 negatively charged electrons. My atomic number is the number of protons. So the atomic number of this atom would be 2. And that's what designates what atom I'm talking about in the periodic table. My atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So here my atomic mass is 4. This, if I scoot back to my table and I look at these numbers up in the corner, these are my atomic numbers. So I look, what has an atomic number of 2? Helium. That atomic number tells me how many protons I have. So this is helium. I can have variations in how many neutrons are in the nucleus. Those are called isotopes. I can have a variation in how many electrons are circling the nucleus. Those are called ions. My proton number is always my proton number, and that tells me what element I'm talking about. All right, so if we look at atomic symbols, when we see our atom written out, we have a symbol or a letter. That's my atomic symbol for carbon. And then we have 2 numbers. In the periodic table, this lower number here is usually the one on the top. But if I'm just writing it out, here is my element, I write it like this. And what these symbols tell me, the letter or 2 letters represent a unique element. So each element has its own letter symbol. These are usually 1 or 2 letters. Many of them, because our words in English come from Greek and Latin, are the same. So C for carbon. Some of them, because the names of the elements are derived from Greek or Latin, sometimes those are different. The first letter of this name is capitalized. So if it's a 2-letter, for instance, gold is AU. The first letter is capitalized. A, the U is not. And AU for gold is because the Latin word for gold is aureus, A-U-R-E-U-S. So that's where that AU for gold comes from. Silver is Argentina. That's where the name for the country Argentina comes from. Argentina comes from because it has what's rich in silver. Ag is a symbol for silver. So that's why some of them don't quite match up like carbon does and oxygen with the atomic symbol O. So when we write this out, not when we're looking at it in the periodic table, but when we write this out, we're going to have a superscripted number in front of it, and that represents the mass number. my mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, because remember, electrons have no mass. So to get the total mass of an element, I add protons and neutrons, and that tells me the mass number. The subscripted number before it, this is always going to be the smaller number if I'm given two numbers. The smaller number, in this case subscripted, is the atomic number. Right? The atomic number, remember, is the number of protons in the nucleus. And for all of the elements, my protons and electron number is usually equal, unless I have an ion, unless I've lost or gained an electron. We'll look at how that happens later. But the atomic number, the smaller number of protons, add that to the number of neutrons, and I get a mass number. So atomic mass is the number of protons plus neutrons. Atomic mass is calculated by adding the atomic mass units of protons and neutrons. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as the mass number or the atomic weight. But if you look at a full periodic table, we have one in our textbook in the appendix, Appendix A. You'll often see, so ours is a simplified one. It has whole numbers. Oh, that's good. Sometimes you'll see the atomic weight or mass given as something with some decimals. So here my atomic mass is 12. A full periodic table would have this is like 12.221234. I'm making that up. I don't have that memorized. I don't know. You would see a decimal with places after that. And what that number tells you is it's not just referring to the mass of that element, but all of its isotopes. So an isotope, so it's the average of all of the isotopes of that element. And what an isotope is, it's an atom with the same number of protons, because that proton number tells us what we're talking about, but it can have different neutrons. So my most abundant form of carbon in the environment is carbon-12. I have 12, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. But I also find isotopes in the environment. Carbon-13 has 6 protons, because carbon always has 6 protons, but how many neutrons does it have? If it's got 6, and my atomic mass is the total protons and neutrons, so 7 or 8 for carbon-14. And so these isotopes can change. They can emit radiation. They break down. They will eventually break down. And the ratio of these in the environment to the most common form can tell us something about the age with carbon-14 as it decays at a known rate. The ratio of these two found in things that are incorporated into organic molecules, into organic matter, can tell us how old something is, because something organic, because this breaks down at a known rate. We're not going to talk about isotopes a whole lot. They're used in medical purposes. They can be used for radioactive dating with carbon isotopes, with oxygen isotopes. So they do have a lot of important uses. We're not going to talk about them, but when you see one of those atomic weights that has a decimal after it, it's because they average in. Okay, 99.9% of the carbon in the world is carbon-12. Its atomic mass is 12. I'm going to have a little bit of 13, a little bit of 14. So if I average the percentage of these into the total weight, I'm going to have a little bit higher number. All right, so the makeup of my cell, my atom. I've got my nucleus, and surrounding around that, I have electron shells. These are sometimes called orbitals or energy levels. So in my atoms, the number of electrons is negatively charged electrons, usually equal to positively charged protons. My opposite charge is valence because my atoms are neutral. The opposites also attract. the negatively charged electrons are attracted to the positive nucleus, and that's what keeps them in orbit around that nucleus. For all my atoms with atomic numbers of 20 or less, so 20 or fewer protons in the nucleus, I have the following rules for how those electrons are going to be distributed around the nucleus. The first energy shell, or the first orbital, can have 2 electrons spinning around outside there. That first energy shell, first orbital, is closest to the nucleus. And it's filled once it has 2 electrons. No more electrons can come into that shell. So then they're going to fall into an orbital that's just outside of that. And that second orbital, or second electron shell, can hold 8 electrons. And then outside of that, we can hold 8 more. So when I'm putting my electrons in place, each shell has to be filled before electrons can go to the next shell. What that looks like, this is called the Bohr model of atoms, is if I have 1 proton and 1 electron, like I do in hydrogen, then that electron goes into the first shell closest to my nucleus. Carbon with 6 protons has 6 electrons. My first 2 go into the first orbital closest to the nucleus. I still have 4 that I have to put somewhere, so I put them into the second orbital. And I can keep putting them in the second orbital. So nitrogen with 7 protons, 7 electrons, 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the second shell. I can keep putting them in this second shell until that has 8. So oxygen, with an atomic number of 8, has 8 electrons, 1, 2 in the first shell, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the second. I can do that until I have 8. So for example, phosphorus with 15 protons, and so 15 electrons, 2 in the first shell, now it's filled. I have to move to my second shell that can hold 8. So I have 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Plus 2, I have 10, but I still need 5 more, so I'm going to go to a third shell. So for our purposes, all we have to remember is 2, 8, and 8. We aren't going to go into more shells than that, but this is what my Bohr model looks like. This is going to be a really, really helpful model when I'm trying to figure out how is this element going to bond with another element to form a molecule? What type of bond is it going to form? So these are very helpful to remember. Nucleus, 2 electrons, and then fall to the second shell. I can hold up to 8. I'm not going to go to a third shell until this is full with 8. So if I have 10, I stop there. Once I get to 11, I need that third shell. So this gets to something we call the octet rule. Atoms want to have a full complement of electrons in their outer shell. We call this outer shell the valence shell. They want that to be full. So the first orbital can only hold 2 electrons, and after that we go to the second orbital. Elements are the most stable when this outer shell, whatever it is, the second, the third, the first, when it's full. So hydrogen only has 1. It's not full yet. So what it wants to do is it wants to bond to fill this up. And it can bond by either taking an electron from another element or sharing with another element so that it has a full outer shell. So all of these want to get to where they have 8 electrons in their outer orbital, or 2 if we're talking about hydrogen. So let's look back. How many atoms are in the valence shell? We figure this out by looking up here at my atomic number. Hydrogen, 1 proton, 1 electron. There's only 1 in that outer shell. It wants 2. Oh, look, helium has 2. So its outer shell, it's that first shell is its valence shell. It has 2, it's full. 3 has 2 and then 1 on the outside. Beryllium has 4, so it has 2 in the first shell, 2 in the second. Boron has 2 in the first shell, 3 in the second. 2 and 4, 2 and 5, 2 and 6, 2 and 7. Ooh, neon has 10. It's full. These are called our noble gases because they have a full outer shell. These are sometimes called the inert elements. Because their outer shell is full, they fulfill the octet rule. They're really happy where they are. They don't care. They don't form bonds. Nothing in this last column forms bonds with other elements because they have fulfilled the octet rule. So chemical bonds. When I have 2 atoms or more joined together to form a molecule, I am going to have a bond that's formed by electrons in the outer shell interacting with each other. So 2 different atoms, or 2 of the same atoms, when their outer electrons are looking to fulfill that octet rule, they can form a bond. So we're looking at just the number of electrons in the outer shell. And when we form a bond, when those outer electrons interact with each other, that's called a chemical reaction. The intensity of that reaction can be predicted by looking at the periodic table. If 2 elements are close to each other horizontally on the table, they can react, but it's usually going to be a mild reaction. If they are far apart horizontally on the table, they're going to react a little more vigorously. So our valence electrons, the number of electrons in an atom's valence shell, determines whether the atom is going to give up those outer electrons, accept electrons from another atom, or share electrons in order to acquire their full outer shell. So when we talk about a molecule, we're talking about 2 or more elements that are bonded together. It's the smallest part of a compound that retains its chemical properties. So a compound means I've got 2 or more elements coming together, different elements coming together. The word compound is used if I have multiple elements, and molecule is usually talking about the same element, but really this distinction has kind of fallen out of favor. This is a molecule of glucose here. It is a compound because it has different elements, but we can refer to that as one molecule of glucose, not one compound of glucose. So this is a chemical formula for glucose, and what it tells us is which atoms and how many of them come together to form this molecule. So this tells me I have 6 atoms of carbon that are bound together with 12 atoms of hydrogen and 6 atoms of oxygen. C6H12O6 is the chemical formula for glucose. I'm not going to ask you to know a lot of chemical formulas, but you'll want to know that one. So a formula tells you the number of each kind of atom that's in a specific molecule. And these are bonded together, and how they're bonding, how their atoms in the valence shells for each of these are reacting, is called chemical bonding. We can look at different types of chemical bonds. So the first one we're going to look at is the easiest one to determine, the ionic bond. So an ion is formed when an atom either gains an extra electron, so then we call it a negative ion, or it loses an electron. We call it a positive ion. So 1 or more electrons from one atom are removed and attach themselves to another atom. When they do that, one of those atoms becomes a positive ion. So the one that lost electrons is a positive ion. That's because it now has more positively charged protons than negatively charged electrons. The one that gained the electrons is a negative ion because it now has more negative charge from those extra negative electrons than a positive charge. The charges that the ions have are opposite, and so they are attracted to each other. So table salt forms an ionic bond. So in this case, my sodium has 1, 2 electrons there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons here. But sodium's atomic number is 11, so we put one more electron out here. The octet rule says that an element wants to have a full outer shell with 8 electrons. To get 8 electrons, sodium has 2 strategies. It can either look for and try to attract 7 other electrons to fill this, or it can kick out that 1 electron. Which one sounds easier? Kick out the 1 electron, right? So now sodium only has 10 electrons, but it still has 11 protons. So it has more protons than electrons, so sodium is now a positive ion. That electron can't just be floating out here, it's going to look for somewhere to land. My chlorine molecule, I have 1, 2, I have 17 is the atomic number for chloride. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. My second shell is full and there are 10 electrons, but I have 17 to balance my protons. That means I have 7 in my outer shell. Well, the chloride has 2 strategies. It can either kick out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons, or it can just look for 1 spare one. Ha! Look at this. I have 1 extra, 1 lonely electron in my outer shell. I just need 1 more to fill my outer shell. So when sodium gives up this electron and the chloride accepts it, I get a sodium ion with a positive charge. My chloride has 1 extra electron, so it becomes negatively charged. It has 1 more electron than it does protons. Now my 2 ions have opposite charges and opposites attract. So these 2 come very close together because of that attraction, and I get sodium chloride, table salt. Ionic bonds, what we're going to look for is an equivalent. It's always 2 different elements and only 2, and the number of electrons in the outer shell of one is going to complement the other. This needs 1, this has 1. One element needs 2, the other has 2. These will tend to be further apart on the periodic table, so it's going to be when I just have 1 or 2 and I need 1 or 2. It's always just 2 elements, so I'm not going to have something like glucose that has 3 different elements. That's not going to form ionic bonds. So what you look for to verify ionic bonds are 1 or 2 electrons in the valence shell, and here 6 or 7. I just need 1 or 2 to get full. And then we're going to come together because our opposite charges attract us. So this is a weak bond. It's easy to dissolve, as you've all seen. If you put salt in water, we're going to dissolve the sodium chloride. So here's a summary of my ionic bonding. My sodium with an atomic number of 11 has that 1 outer electron, so it's more likely to just give that up. Chloride, my chlorine atom has an atomic number of 17, has 7 outer electrons. It just needs 1. It's more likely to just take an electron. And as they come close together, they're going to pack into this crystalline structure. So that's the easiest type of bond to recognize. Covalent bonds are formed when 2 atoms are more close together. They're nearer to each other horizontally on the periodic table. So there is not that really strong opposite attraction of you have one and I need one. Far away, we're going to forcefully come together. One's going to steal an electron from the other. Covalent bonds, we're going to share. So those atoms are going to spend part of their time around one of the atoms. The electrons are going to spend part of their time around one atom and part around the other. So electrons in the outer shell are shared between the two different atoms when we have covalent bonds. So I always think of we're cooperating to completely fill our outer shell. So we're going to share electrons. With covalent bonding, we can share multiple different elements can be involved in this sharing. I'm not going to just have one and one. I'm not just going to have one sodium with one chlorine. Here's where I can get those subscripts. I can have double, triple covalent bonds. So some examples. Remember, hydrogen just had its one lonely electron. So hydrogens are going to come together to form a hydrogen molecule, H2, with two hydrogens. We're not going to find them alone a lot because they want to have that full outer shell. So they'll just share. Two will come together and share their electrons. This electron will spend part of its time here, part here. This electron will spend part of its time here, part here. I always kind of draw that like a figure 8, that they're going to be just circling around, kind of drawing these two together, spending part of their time here and here. Oxygen, same thing. The oxygen around us in the air is O2. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8, so it has 2 electrons in its first shell and then 6 in its outer. It needs 2 more to get filled. This needs 2 more to get filled. They're both close to filled, so instead of stealing away those, we're just going to share them, and then we'll both be happy. This is an example of methane. Carbon has my 6, 1, 2, and then 4. Hydrogen, with its 1, wants to fill that by sharing. So carbon can share with 4 hydrogens. Each one of these hydrogens is going to share one of these electrons, and it's going to share its own electron with carbon that needs 4. Look at that. And now they're all happy. So we have CH4 methane. You can see we're going to draw this. If we draw what this molecule looks like, either way, the hydrogens are balanced out nicely all around this. They're evenly distributed. So this is a covalent bond. We're sharing, and we're sharing evenly. So with covalent bondings, 2 or more atoms share electrons. Here's my nitrogen. So nitrogen has 7 protons, so 7 electrons. I have 2 in my inner shell, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in my outer shell. So how many electrons does nitrogen need to have a full outer shell? 3, right? Because it's got 5 in its outer shell. So it needs 8 in its outer shell. Not 8 total, but 8 in its outer shell. So 3 more. So nitrogen can form up to 3 covalent bonds with hydrogen. Remember that hydrogen has 1, so put 3 hydrogens. NH3 is ammonia. And that forms pretty regularly to make everybody happy. So in those examples, the hydrogens share their atoms equally with another element. And we call those non-polar covalent bonds. So we're going to look at polar covalent. Non-polar means because I'm sharing my atoms equally everywhere, the entire molecule has a neutral charge everywhere around it. With polar covalent bonds, those electrons are shared unequally. One of the elements involved is going to be an electron hog. An example of this is water. When water forms covalent bonds between 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogens, the oxygen molecule is an electron hog. So electronegativity is a term that's used to describe the ability of an atom to attract electrons to itself. Some atoms are more electronegative. They have a greater affinity for electrons. They'll pull them closer to them more tightly. So in water, the oxygen atom is more electronegative than the hydrogen atoms. And so it keeps those electrons close to it longer than the hydrogen. It kind of hogs them to itself. And what that results in, we call a polar covalent bond, because here's my oxygen. My hydrogens aren't distributed evenly. They're kind of tucked into one side. And those electrons spend more of their time around the oxygen. And because they spend more of their time here on the oxygen part of my molecule, this is a little bit negatively charged, just a little. And this end of the molecule, this side of the molecule, has slight positive charge. I like to draw my waters to look like Mickey Mouse, like this. So every water molecule that I have has one side where the hydrogens tend to stay, where the hydrogens are, that's slightly positive, and then the side with the oxygens is slightly negative. So in the case of the hydrogen bond, or the polar covalent bonds between hydrogen and oxygen, those bonds keep the hydrogens at a 105-degree angle here, giving water a little Mickey Mouse look. When I put my waters together, my hydrogens with their slightly positive side, opposites attract. That hydrogen side of the molecule is attracted to the negative, to the slightly negatively charged oxygen side. This is called hydrogen bonding. When I get oppositely charged parts of adjacent molecules, so I have polar covalent bonds giving me polarity to my molecule, giving me a positive and a negative side, and then those positive and negative sides in two adjacent molecules are attracted to each other. So here is my water, my H2O. When I put lots of waters together, this slightly positive side is drawn to the slightly negative side of adjacent water molecules of the oxygen. This oxygen is drawn to the slightly positive charge of adjacent hydrogens in the next water. So these hydrogen bonds are between molecules. It's not within a molecule. It's not holding a molecule together. It's drawing molecules close. These hydrogen bonds are responsible for a lot of the properties that we're going to look at when we look at the chemistry of water. So water has a lot of unique properties. There are videos for you to watch on those. Just real quickly, we'll cover these. So those properties are cohesion, adhesion. It's the universal solvent, has a high specific heat, and it expands as it freezes. So just very briefly, cohesion is the ability of water molecules, or the tendency of water molecules to stick together. Right? So those hydrogen bonds connecting, those weak hydrogen bonds connecting one molecule to another, that's cohesion, and it gives water properties like surface tension. If you want to see an example of surface tension, fill a glass all the way to the rim, and then just slowly add one drop at a time, and you can get a dome. You can actually get the water to pile up above the top of the glass until gravity, the force of gravity is greater than cohesion, and the water spills all over the side and makes a mess. But that's an example of cohesion. Another example of cohesion is a lot of plant surfaces that are waxy. You'll see the water, like on elephant ears, you'll see the water ball up on top. That water is sticking to itself. Adhesion is the tendency for water to stick to other substances. So adhesion, you learned about the meniscus when we looked at metric measurement and using a graduated cylinder. And the meniscus is the lowest point of the water. The water is sort of in a U shape as it goes up the glass. Adhesion is what draws the water up the glass. So the water is attracted to and sticks to other surfaces. And so it's sticking and climbing up the glass. Adhesion is the tendency of water to stick to other substances. Universal solvent, more things dissolve, more molecules will separate into their component parts than in any other liquid. So it's the universal solvent because more things, other than lipids, more things will dissolve in water than any other liquid. And that's really, really important in biology because inside of our cells, we have aqueous solution. We have a water solution. There are things dissolved in it, but all our chemical reactions that take place in a cell happen inside that cell or inside that aqueous solution. And that ability of that aqueous, that water solution to dissolve things makes all of those components, all those elements available for other chemical reactions. Remember, metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions in a cell. So this ability of water to dissolve things makes all those elements available for new chemical reactions. Water has a high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to make water increase in temperature. And then water will hold on to that heat for a very long time before it will release it. And we see this in how long it takes water to boil. For water to go from liquid to gas, every single one of those hydrogen bonds has to be broken before water can become steam, before it can evaporate. So we have to put a lot of heat in. It's got to sit on the stove over that heat for a long, long time. Similarly, it takes a long time for water to freeze because all of those bonds have to get to the same temperature. All that motion has to slow down to the same extent. And then it's not going to give up. So it's not going to give up its heat. It's not going to lose its heat readily. And the benefit for that is that it stabilizes temperatures. So homeostasis, maintaining a constant internal environment, the fact that we can go out into really hot weather and not evaporate entirely or melt or freeze, and maintain body temperature. We're liquid. It helps us to maintain temperature. More importantly, it helps the planet to maintain temperature. So you'll see it takes a really long time for the ocean to heat up. As the sun hits it, the ocean heats up throughout the day and then very, very, very slowly releases that heat at night. Water temperature does not change nearly as rapidly as air temperature. Air can heat up and cool down quickly, but water does not. So it helps to maintain a constant temperature, not only in living organisms, but in water bodies and on the planet as a whole, which we're pushing some limits with that now and heating, adding enough energy to the oceans to raise their average temperature. The last one, I think some of you have talked about this in our discussion, is that water expands as it freezes, which is pretty amazing. Most things, as their temperature goes down, they become more and more dense. But water will continue to become more and more dense as temperature decreases until about 2 degrees Celsius, when all of a sudden all of those hydrogen bonds become the exact same length and water takes on a crystalline structure, capturing oxygen inside of it, making water less dense. So water is less dense. That crystalline structure pushes the molecules further apart than we would expect. For any other liquid, we could predict what would happen and it would continue to condense to get more and more dense. Water hits a certain point and all those molecules are the exact same distance apart, giving it a crystalline, less dense structure, meaning water floats on itself as a solid when it freezes. That's hugely important. A lot of people instantly think, oh, well, that has to do with the sea level rise. And, no, because it would. But the really, really, really important part is life would cease to exist if water froze and became solid. It would sink. Because if you think about it, every water body, the reason that water would freeze in a water body is because it's exposed to cold air temperatures. If the surface water froze and sunk to the bottom, it would leave more liquid water at the surface to freeze and sink, leaving more liquid exposed to freeze and sink, and water bodies would freeze all the way through, ending life in that water body. So if anybody's been on a pond during the wintertime or on a lake in the wintertime, a frozen lake, you can see life goes on. We go ice fishing. We can walk across and see fish and otters and life continuing underneath because that layer of ice acts as an insulator. The water below it isn't exposed to freezing temperatures, and so it won't freeze. So that allows continuity of life through seasons. All right, so you can watch the videos and read more about those properties of life and why they're so important. Moving on here to the last portion of the chapter on acids and bases and pH. We did a lab on this. Our pH is hydrogen potential. pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. So what that means is in water at any given time, I have H2O. A few of these H2Os are going to dissociate. At any given time, I have a few of these that have separated. They've split up. They don't split up into H2 and O. They split up into a hydrogen ion. So that means it's lost its electron. And over here, this hydroxide, the OH, has gained it. These are going to split apart, go back together, split apart, go back together. The reason we say water is neutral is because I am always going to have the same number of hydrogens and hydroxides separated. So this is even. Same number of hydrogens and hydroxides. How many is it? It's the inverse log 7. So if I wanted to know how many of these, only a very, very, very few, inverse log 7 means 10 to the minus 7, or 1 over 10 to the 7, means out of 1, 2, 300,000 million, or 10 million particles, 1 of each out of 10 million molecules of water. So very, very few, but because I have the same number, see, this is neutral. It's neither an acid or a base. Water is neutral. That pH 7 is because when I write pH, I just say pH 7. I use this number, my exponent here, but that's what that 7 really means. And because it's logarithmic, each 1 unit of pH is really times 10. So add another 0. So you see I have 7 zeros here. So acids, are substances that increase hydrogen ion concentration. Bases are substances that either increase the hydroxide ion concentration or remove the hydrogen ions. So acids can either release hydrogen and take up hydroxides, or just release hydrogens. So what does that mean? So acids are substances that when they dissociate in water, they release hydrogen ions. They increase the hydrogen ion concentration. So they dissociate in water, meaning they split up into hydrogen and something else. So let's look at hydrochloric acid. It's HCl. So we're talking about it dissociating in water. So here I have my water, which is going to dissociate. It's still going to have mostly water, but it's also going to dissociate into some hydrogens and some hydroxide, the same number, so still neutral. But when I put hydrochloric acid in there, this is also going to split. So now what I have in that water is some water, some hydrogens and some hydroxides. Oops, sorry, that should be a minus, on this side of the equation. And because of this hydrochloric acid, I also get more hydrogens and those chloride ions. So now compared to water, I have more hydrogens. This means it's an acid. I get more hydrogens. That's what an acid means, that it dissociates and puts these into the solution when I dissolve it in water. So that's an acid. Bases give me a high hydroxide concentration. These are relative to each other. Right? So I'm looking at how many of these do I have compared to, how many hydroxides do I have compared to hydrogens? Well, here I have more hydrogens, so it must be an acid. Right? And I could get that by either removing hydroxides or by adding hydrogens. Bases have a low hydrogen ion concentration relative to hydroxides. So an example, sodium hydroxide, drain cleaner, is sodium NaOH. So when it dissociates, it dissociates into sodium and hydroxides. So in water, I'm still going to have hydrogens and hydroxides, and then this is going to add more hydroxides. It is going to lower the pH because I will have relatively fewer hydrogens. I mean, it will raise the pH because I have relatively fewer hydrogens. Sorry about that. And pH measure is looking at hydrogens. And because it's the inverse log, lower hydrogen numbers mean higher acid. So let's go back to these numbers. Right? So the actual number of the pH refers to this number here, to my denominator. The smaller my denominator, the bigger my total number is. So smaller numbers on the pH scale give me more acidity, a higher measure of hydrogen ions. So low numbers on the pH scale are more acidic. High numbers are more basic. So there's my scale. Acids fall on this side because this number really means 1/10 to this number of hydrogens, 1/10 raised to this number of hydrogens. So these numbers mean more hydrogens. Low numbers, more hydrogen ions. And the last thing we talk about in this chapter are buffers. Buffers are solutes that are in water that let it resist a change in pH. So buffers, I think of them as working like a teeter-totter. If I add to one side, the other side's released. If hydrogen ions are added, the buffer is going to counter by absorbing those hydrogens or releasing hydroxides to bring it back to balance. Or if hydroxides, a base is added, the buffer can counter by releasing hydrogens. So in our bloodstream, we have the bicarbonate buffering system. At any given time in our blood, we have some carbonic acid, we have bicarbonate, and we have hydrogen ions. If my blood becomes more acidic, maybe I'm drinking lots of orange juice or something, becomes more acidic, I'm adding more and more hydrogens to this side of the equation. So this is in balance, it goes back and forth. If I add more of these, they're going to be taken up and converted to carbonic acid. If I add OHs, if I add a base, I'm going to add to this side, this is going to start to separate and release hydrogens to keep the entire system in balance. So a buffer doesn't keep things neutral. It's not trying to keep a neutral pH of 7. It's trying to keep the pH that it is supposed to be at. So in our stomach, a buffer would keep our stomach pH at about a pH of 2 because our stomach should be acidic. Our bloodstream should be basic, about 7.8. And so a buffer doesn't work to make our blood a 7. It works to make our bloodstream continuously 7.8. So buffers resist change in pH or prevent a change in pH. Why do we care? Homeostasis. So different parts, blood 7.4, slightly alkaline, not 7.8. Things have to stay in homeostasis. They have to stay in the pH that they need to be in. So we have buffers to make sure we stay in homeostasis. And that's it for chapter 2. We'll have chapter 3 up shortly. Thank you.